And you've got a community who is more connected, more engaged with each other. You know, I love people, and I think that everybody deserves the opportunity to be able to fulfil their potential, no matter their background or where they were born or the circumstances they were born into. But unfortunately, we know through a lot of research and the consistent evidence base that disadvantage has a postcode, it has a location, and this entrenched disadvantage that happens in communities, particularly when we live in a society that's very wealthy and quite, very well off. Australia's a, very thriving nation, to have ingrained disadvantage in many places, particularly where there's been consistent social housing environments as well. It's actually not fair, and that the life outcomes of people who live there should be determined because of where they're born and live is not fair. So I've worked in government, I've worked in small and medium business, I've worked in parliamentary roles. So I've worked across the sectors a bit and with NGOs, and what I've seen or discovered through all those experiences is that all the sectors, government and non-government, are part of the problem, and they're also part of the solution. So those sectors tend to work in silos or in isolation, and don't look at people or communities holistically. And so kind of back a few years ago, I discovered a Stanford Social Innovation Review's Collective Impact Framework. And it was like an aha moment for me. It was, wow, you align the sectors, you have collective decision making, you ensure community or the social challenge, you have a common agenda, is at the centre, and you work together long term to change things. And it really resonated with me, given all the experiences I had. I'd run state, government programs where there'd be a cycle of funding and a political cycle, and it'd start to work really well, and then the cycle would come to the end, and somebody else would be elected, and then they'd completely change the agenda. So you'd raise hope and start to see change with communities, and then that would be taken away. And so that does often more damage, because to build trust, to work with communities and for them to feel like something can change and can be sustained, gets undermined because of the nature of the cycles of government and funding and other things. So to see that you could work on things long term, and that it was really the community should be at the centre, and the sectors working together through their leadership to align resources to serve the community's needs long term, really, really appealed to me. But early on, there was still a lot of well, how do you do that? And how do you even start something that lasts 10 to 20 years? So when you're working with people in government or the NGO sector particularly, that's very hard to get your head around, because you're operating in an environment where you're restricted or restrained by those cycles. And so, I worked with some great leaders in the Illawarra to see if this was something that they were interested in doing. So it was government, non-government, university, city council. And there was a real appetite, because they wanted to see something change in the communities that they knew, even at a postcode level, had sustained intergenerational disadvantage. So, and then the question came, well, how do we start something that can last that long, because we may not even be in these roles? And so we developed an incubation year. And so that was really to understand the data, so everything was evidence informed, talk deeply and engage deeply with community about really simple things, and deeply listening, actually hearing what it is that people want, not making decisions and consulting and doing what others think needs to be done, because communities are a little bit over having things done to them. So we made sure anything that happened was with the community. And that deep engagement and deep listening came from asking some really simple questions that were very aspirational based. So what kind of community do you want to live in? how is that different from now? Who would you trust to help make the changes? And then also around, would they like to be involved? And so from there, it sparked some really interesting conversations, because community members were like, oh, no one's ever asked us this before, and this is really interesting. And so we were able to engage with people who we had never spoken to before, who had previously been quite disengaged, and then involve them in a co-designing process about, well, what is it that we could work on? And have that informed by the data. So we worked really closely with the government agencies around their own data sets to see what they were seeing through that quantitative data. But we looked at it through the lens of the community's voice, because I think that's a mistake that can often be made. So for instance, community was telling us in Bellambi that crime was the biggest challenge, the thing they just couldn't get past, which was preventing them from engaging in other things like employment and work or other services that they need in other areas of complexity in their lives. But the crime statistics weren't reflecting that. And so then we realised very quickly people were fearful to report things because of retribution. So the more conversations we had, that became really clear. And so we knew that the crime stats were a false baseline. So we worked really closely with the local area commander, who was just extraordinary at the time, the social housing tenancy staff, because Bellambi is in the largest social housing estate in the Illawarra. And we also worked with the community development staff from the City Council and some brave residents, and created a safety group where people could start to feel like they could report. We'd walk around the estate, mark up where there was, lights that had been broken that would need to be fixed, branches, it was pretty rough to start with. There was a lot of rubbish. It was burnt out cars. It was pretty rugged. And then people started to feel like they could safely report. And so the crime stats went through the roof within 3 months, and then police had evidence, and then they could act on that evidence. And when that started to happen, the community realised, you're, as a group, collective group, you're serious about this. Something will really happen and change. And so that helped us build trust in the community. So looking back, trust is such an important thing. And it doesn't come easily. It has to be earned, really, in a community that has had so many broken promises made to them over such a long period of time, and is actually having a really tough time. And so we were in a fortunate position of being able to build that trust much more quickly than we'd imagined. But it's because we listened and then worked together on doing what it was community actually wanted to have done. So from there, so we started working on things straight away like that with the community, but then we also worked on a really big action plan that covered 4 kind of theme areas. There was 123 actions in the first action plan, and we just worked on them all together, working through them. And we were able to align resources to deliver those actions through the advisory board partners, which included a number of government agencies, the NGO peak body, the City Council and the university, and ourselves as ASIT as neutral facilitators. And then having ASIT as that neutral vehicle and, financial and pooled resourcing capabilities could then pull those and apply them to what it was that community was saying they needed, and to implement that action plan. And so some of the results from that action plan have been a population level reduction in early childhood vulnerability, which is quite significant. Our work with Bunnings in brokering Bunnings to be built right next to the housing estates created 150 jobs. Education and employment through that, and our early learning preschool enrolments has improved things significantly there. It's a safer place. There's less crime. There's less use of public violence. Reduction in public alcohol and drug use, I know people in the community and others in the region of that community at times would refer to the community as a rubbish tip. The safety group took it upon themselves over a period of time to do rubbish collection, to connect across the community and pick up papers. They still meet regularly, and the complaint is made that we have to walk so far to find anything to put in the bin now. So lovely success problems. And you've got a community who is more connected, more engaged with each other, especially the Aboriginal community. I mean, Reconciliation Walk in that community only started a few years ago, and now there's close to 3,000 people come to that every year. The population of Bellambi is 4,000 people, and it's the largest reconciliation event in the Illawarra Shoalhaven. And that's been all community driven in collaboration with the local school, Aboriginal elder and the Aboriginal community. So, there's lots and lots of things, and they're all interconnected. But I think it comes down to the community being heard and ensuring their voice stays at the centre of any collective work, and that the resources can be aligned and applied to what it is that the community needs. And that neutral facilitation, which I think is key to what the Australian Social Investment Trust provides to that work, because there's always vested interests and pushing and pulling for a whole range of reasons. But to be able to stay that neutral course, I think has played a really important role to ensure the community has stayed at the centre, and the changes that the community has really helped make for themselves have been able to happen.